The gavel struck wood with a sound like a breaking bone. In the dusty heat of the Guthrie stockyard, they weren't auctioning cattle. They were auctioning the labor of convicts. Josephine Gable, a widow with a failing ranch and calloused hands, stepped forward. She wasn't there for a cut-rate farmhand. She was there for the man in the back cage, the one they called a broken outlaw. His eyes were pure ice, in a face bruised purple. They said he was a monster. She looked at him at the blood on his shirt and the chains on his wrists, and laid down every last dollar she had. She wasn't just buying a laborer. She was buying a ghost. The dust on the road from Guthrie to the Gablecrest Ranch was a fine red powder that coated everything, including Josephine Gable's lungs. It was a 3-day ride, and she'd spent the last of her savings not on feed or new stock, but on the silent, shackled man sitting in the back of her buckboard. Her ranch, the Gablecrest, was all she had left of her husband, Robert. A good man, a strong man taken by a sudden fever 2 winters back. Since then, it had been a daily war against debt drought and the predatory advances of her neighbor Bartholomew Bart Drummond. Drummond, a man whose wealth was as vast as his conscience was small, had been circling her land like a vulture, waiting for her to fail. This last trip to Guthrie was a desperate act. The bank, run by a stern-faced man named Mr. Abernathy, had given her a final notice. She needed hands to round up the last of her marketable steers, or Drummond would effectively own her by Christmas. She hadn't gone to the convict labor auction. That was a step too far even for her. She had gone to the U.S. Marshal's office to register a complaint about Drummond's men cutting her fences, a complaint she knew Marshal Elias Kent would file and forget. That's where she saw him. He was being dragged in by 2 bounty hunters' men who smelled of stale whiskey and trail dirt. The prisoner was a wreck. He was tall but stooped from exhaustion. His hair was a matted dark thatch, and his face was a geography of pain, a split lip, a swollen eye, and a deep gash over his cheekbone. But it was his eyes that held her. They weren't broken. They were quiet, deep, and filled with a cold, controlled fire that terrified and fascinated her. "What's he in for?" she'd asked the deputy. "Jackson Rourke." The deputy had muttered, not looking up from his paperwork. Alias Jax, horse thief, bank robbery, and suspected murder. Part of Silas Vane's old Red Cimarron crew. Bounty was $500, dead or alive. These fellas brought him in alive. Barely. Josephine watched as the bounty hunters argued with Marshal Kent. They wanted their money, and Kent was arguing about the jurisdiction. Rourke was wanted in Texas, but was caught here in Oklahoma Territory. "He's going to hang," the deputy added, sharpening a pencil. "Soon as the Texas Rangers send a man for him." Josephine looked at her worn purse. She had $600 in it. It was everything. It was meant for fence wire, for Shorty's back pay, for survival. She saw Rourke slump against the wall, his hands chained. He wasn't just a criminal. He looked used up, thrown away, like one of her father's old tools, rusted and cracked, but still made of good steel. "Marshal," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. The men stopped arguing. What if his bond was paid? Kent looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "Ma'am, this isn't a stray calf. This is Jackson Rourke. He ain't eligible for bond." "But the bounty," she pressed, her mind racing. "The bounty is $500. If I pay the bounty, I've bought the debt, haven't I? The bounty hunters get their money, and the territory gets, well, what does it get? It gets a murderer off its hands." The bounty hunter snarled, seeing an opportunity. "He hasn't been convicted," Josephine said, surprising herself. "You said suspected murder." Kent sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He was a tired man. "Mrs. Gable, what are you proposing? I have a ranch. I need laborers. You have a prisoner you don't want to feed. I'll pay the $500 bounty, and I'll sign papers of indenture. He works for me to pay off the bond. He stays on my land. If he steps 1 foot off the gable crest, you can hunt him down, and I forfeit the money. It's better than hanging an innocent man." "Innocent?" the bounty hunter scoffed. "He's indentured until his trial." She improvised, her heart hammering. "A working prisoner. My responsibility." It was insane. It was financial suicide. But the thought of Bart Drummond's smug face as he foreclosed on her land was worse. She needed a hand. A strong one. And this man, despite the blood and bruises, looked strong. It took an hour of arguing. Kent, seeing a way to clear his cell and avoid a paperwork nightmare, finally agreed. The bounty hunters got their money. Josephine signed a stack of documents that effectively made her the man's custodian. If he ran, she lost everything. Now he sat in the buckboard, his silence heavier than the chains that bound his wrists. She hadn't been able to afford the key to the leg irons, so his ankles were still shackled, the chain rattling with every rut in the road. They said she bought an outlaw. Maybe she had. But as she looked at the setting sun, painting the prairie in shades of orange and violet, Josephine Gable knew one thing: she hadn't just made a gamble. She had lit a fuse, and she had no idea how long it was. They arrived at the Gable Crest well after midnight under a cold, indifferent moon. The ranch was quiet, which was almost worse than noise. It was the quiet of decline. Josephine's only full-time hand, Shorty Maguire, met them at the barn. Shorty was a gnarled old cowboy, loyal to Robert's memory and deeply protective of Josephine. He was closer to 70 than 60, his back bent like a river willow, but his eyes were sharp. He held his lantern high, illuminating the man Josephine helped down from the buckboard. The rattle of chains brought a look of profound disbelief to Shorty's face. "Josie, what in the blue blazes is this?" Shorty's voice was a low growl. He dropped his gaze to the shackles. "You went to town for supplies, not this. This is Jackson Rourke Shorty. He's our new hand." Josephine said, her voice firm, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. Shorty's eyes snapped back to the prisoner. "Rourke Jackson, Rourke, as in the Red Cimarron boys." "Josie, have you lost your mind? That's Silas Vane's man. He's a killer. He's an indentured laborer." Josephine cut in her tone, sharp. "His bounty is paid. He works for us. That's the arrangement. Now help me get him to the old bunkhouse." "The old bunkhouse near the main house? You ain't putting him in the barn." "He's a man, Shorty, not an animal. He'll stay there." The man Rourke hadn't said a word. He just stood, watching his breathing, shallow. He looked ready to collapse. Shorty, grumbling about rattlesnakes in the parlor, grabbed his rifle from beside the barn door before stomping ahead. They half-dragged, half-walked the prisoner to the small, dusty cabin that hadn't been used since Robert's father passed. Josephine lit a lamp inside. It was one room with a cot, a small stove, and a single window. "The leg irons, Mrs. Gable," Rourke said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, cracked with thirst and pain. The sound of it sent a shiver down her spine. It was a voice that didn't match the rumors. It wasn't cruel. It was just empty. "I don't have the key," she said, feeling a flush of shame. "The marshal kept it. I only had enough for the bounty." He nodded once, a sharp, tired movement. He looked at the cot, then at his own feet. "Then I'll need a hammer. And a cold chisel." Josephine stared. "What?" "To get these off. Can't ride, can't work, unless you want me splitting wood on your porch." Shorty hefted his rifle. You ain't getting your hands on a hammer, boy. You'll sit right there till we figure this." Rourke's icy gaze flicked to Shorty. "That old Winchester 73 you're holding firing pins, Warren. It'll misfire 1 in every 3 shots. You ought to get that fixed." Shorty's mouth dropped open. Josephine, stunned, looked at the old man who instinctively checked his rifle. How'd you know that?" Shorty stammered. "Saw the wear on the hammer when you raised the lamp. Now the chisel, or I'm useless to you." Josephine made a decision. "Shorty, get the tools, and a bucket of water, and that salve from the stable. Josie, do it, Shorty. I'll be fine." Shorty left, muttering curses. Josephine and the outlaw were alone. The silence was deafening. He was filthy, caked in mud and dried blood. "Take off your shirt," she ordered. He looked at her, one eyebrow raised in a semblance of the man he might have been. "Ma'am, I'm not having you die of infection before you've worked off a single dollar of that bond. Take it off. I need to see the wounds." He hesitated, then, with painful slowness, pulled the torn, bloody linen over his head. Josephine gasped. His face was bad, but his body was a roadmap of violence. Old scars puckered, and white crisscrossed his ribs. But it was the new injuries that shocked her. His left side was a massive mottled purple, his ribs clearly broken. But on his right shoulder, high near the collarbone, was a fresh brand. It wasn't a ranch brand. It was a letter, a stylized V. "Vane," she whispered. "Silas Vane did this to you." Rourke's entire body went rigid. He didn't look at her. He stared at the wall. The water. "Please." Shorty returned, tools in hand. He threw them on the floor with a clang. For the next hour, Josephine watched in horrified silence. She held the lamp, while Rourke, with the methodical patience of a blacksmith, placed the chisel on the central link of his leg chains and instructed Shorty to strike it with the hammer. It was brutal. Sparks flew. The noise was shattering, but Rourke didn't flinch. He just held the chisel steady, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched, until the link finally snapped. He dropped the heavy chains to the floor. He stood, testing his weight. He was free of them at least. "Get some rest," Josephine said, her voice softer now. "Work starts at dawn." "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, already moving toward the door. "You'll sleep here," she insisted. "And you'll eat here. Shorty will bring you a plate." He stopped at the door, his back to her. Why this the bunkhouse? The solve. "I paid $500 for you, Mr. Rourke. I intend to get my money's worth. Dead men can't mend fences." He was silent for a long moment. "My name is Jax, and you didn't buy a laborer, Mrs. Gable. You bought a target. You should have left me to hang." He walked out of the bunkhouse, not to the barn, but to the water trough. In the moonlight, she watched him plunge his head and shoulders into the icy water, the sound of his ragged gasp carrying on the night air. Shorty stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching him. "This is bad, Josie," Shorty said quietly as she joined him. "That V brand, that's Vane's mark. It means he's a traitor to the gang. That's worse than being wanted by the law. That means they'll hunt him, and they'll hunt him here." "Let them come," Josephine said, wrapping her arms around herself, the lie feeling cold on her lips. "We need him, Shorty. We need him to save this ranch. And who," the old man asked, "is going to save us from him?" The next few weeks at the Gable Crest settled into a tense, unspoken rhythm. Jax Rourke, as he insisted on being called, was a silent storm of activity. He woke before the sun, and by the time Josephine and Shorty emerged from the main house, he had already mucked the stalls, patched the hole in the corral fence, and was sharpening tools in the smithy. He worked with a desperate, terrifying efficiency. He was a man possessed, as if hard labor was the only thing holding him together. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in short, clipped sentences about the work. That mare's got a stone bruise. Fence line at the north pasture is weak. Need more oats? Shorty watched him with open suspicion, his Winchester never far from his hand. He ain't natural, Shorty complained to Josephine one evening. He don't eat with us. He don't talk. He just works. And he watches. Always watching the horizon, Josie. He's expecting something. Josephine had noticed it too. Jax never stood in an open doorway. He never sat with his back to a window. He moved with a predator's grace, and his eyes, which had lost their beaten-down haze and regained their icy clarity, missed nothing. But she was also seeing something else. The Gable Crest had a stallion, a magnificent, dangerous animal named Tempest. Robert had bought him for breeding, but the horse was pure, unadulterated rage. He'd nearly killed 2 ranch hands and had been penned up for a year, useless and wild. One afternoon, Josephine saw Jax standing at the stallion's corral. He wasn't holding a rope or a whip. He was just there, leaning against the fence, perfectly still. Tempest, usually a frenzy of thundering hoofs and bared teeth, was standing in the center of the corral, watching him. "You stay away from that one, Rourke," Shorty called out, walking over. "He'll take your head off." Jax didn't turn. "He's not angry. He's scared. He's a devil is what he is," Shorty spat. "He's been mishandled." Jax said, his voice quiet. He unlatched the gate. "Don't you do it," Shorty yelled, raising his rifle. "Josie needs that horse, for stud, not for a funeral." Jax slipped inside the corral and shut the gate behind him. Tempest snorted, pawing the ground, his eyes rolling. "Get out of there, you fool!" Shorty was frantic. "Put the rifle down, Shorty." Jax said, his voice calm, never taking his eyes off the horse. "He can smell your fear. It's making him worse." Jax didn't approach the horse. He walked to the center of the corral and sat down in the dust, crossing his legs. He simply sat. Tempest charged, stopping just feet from him, kicking up a cloud of dirt. Jax didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just sat, breathing slow and even. For an hour, Josephine and Shorty watched from the fence line. The stallion would charge, snort, and retreat, testing this strange, calm creature in his domain. Finally, the horse's curiosity overcame its fear. It took a hesitant step, then another. It lowered its massive head and sniffed at Jax's hair. Slowly, like a man moving through water, Jax lifted a hand. He didn't try to pat the horse. He just held his hand out, palm up. The horse nudged it. By sundown, Jax Rourke was stroking the stallion's neck. By the end of the week, he was riding him. Josephine watched him ride Tempest bareback across the open prairie, man and horse moving as one. It was a display of patience and power she had never witnessed. This was not the work of a brutal killer. This was the work of a man who understood things, broken things. That evening, she found him in the barn, rubbing down the stallion whose coat shone like black satin. "That was remarkable," she said. He just grunted his focus on the horse's leg. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father. Before." He stopped as if the word "before" was a door he'd accidentally opened. "Before you joined Vane," she ventured. His back stiffened. He dropped the rag and turned to face her. The barn was dim shafts of dusty gold light cutting through the gloom. His eyes were hard. "You need to understand something, Mrs. Gable. You and Shorty. You think I'm a stray dog you brought home. You're wrong. A stray dog might be grateful. I'm not. I'm a wolf in a trap, and the rest of the pack is still out there. You saving me? That was just ringing the dinner bell. Why did he brand you Jax that V? Shorty says it's for traitors." He looked away, his jaw working. He picked up a brush and began grooming Tempest with short, angry strokes. Vain. He wanted to move on a bank in Coffeyville, a bank that held the savings for the whole county. Farmers, widows, men who'd just been paid for the big cattle drives. He wanted it all. Jax's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I disagreed." "You disagreed. You're an outlaw. You rob banks. There's robbing and then there's ruining," he said, his voice dropping. "We hit trains, payrolls, insured money. This was different. This was people's lives." I told him no. I told him the gang wouldn't stand for it. He paused, the memory clearly painful. I was wrong. They stood for it. And for my opinion he held me down. And he gave me this, to remind me who I belonged to. Then they did the job anyway, and left me for dead. But the bounty, it said suspected murder. The bank manager, he had a family. Vane shot him. On the way out, he pointed at me and told the townsfolk, "That's your man, Jackson Rourke." He framed me for the one thing I tried to stop. A tear traced a clean path through the dirt on Josephine's cheek. She hadn't realized she was crying. "So you've been running? From Vane? And from the law?" He finally looked at her. The ice in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, weary ocean of pain. "There's nowhere left to run, Mrs. Gable. I knew that when those bounty hunters found me. I was just done. Then you walked in. My name is Josephine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He held her gaze. "Josephine, you need to let me go. Ride Tempest out of here. I'll head south. Vane will follow me. Your ranch will be safe." "No," she said, the word stronger than she felt. "I paid $500 for you. You're not leaving until this ranch is solvent. We have steers to round up." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen. It transformed his battered face. "Steers?" "Yes, ma'am." He turned back to the horse, but the air in the barn had changed. The tension was still there, but it was no longer just fear. It was something else. Something complicated. And as Josephine walked back to the house, she realized with a jolt that for the first time since Robert died, she hadn't thought about Bart Drummond all day. She was too busy thinking about the outlaw in her barn. With Jax's relentless work ethic and his uncanny ability to tame both Tempest and the other half-wild horses, the Gable Crest began to look less like a place of defeat and more like a working ranch. Fences were mended, the barn roof was patched, and for the first time in 2 years, Josephine was bringing in steers from the high pastures, herding them into the holding pens for the upcoming cattle drive to Abilene. Shorty, though still wary, had traded his rifle for a grudging respect. He'd seen Jax reshoe a horse in record time, saw him splint a calf's broken leg, and watched him ride Tempest into a stampeding herd to turn them a feat Shorty himself wouldn't have attempted in his prime. "The boy's got sand, I'll give him that," Shorty admitted to Josephine. "And he's a demon for work, but he's still Vane's man. Don't you forget it." "He's not Vane's man," Josephine countered more sharply than she intended. "He's my man. He's indentured to this ranch." But even as she said it, she knew it was becoming a lie. The indenture felt less like a chain and more like a fragile thread she was clinging to. She found herself bringing an extra biscuit with his plate, ensuring the coffee was hot when he came in from the cold. She'd watch him from the kitchen window, his powerful frame moving with purpose, and her heart, which she'd thought buried with Robert, would give a painful, confused flutter. The small, fragile piece was shattered, one sun-scorched afternoon. Bartholomew, Bart Drummond, rode onto her property, flanked by 2 of his hired gunsmen, with mean eyes and low-slung holsters. Drummond was a big man, soft in the middle, who dressed in expensive East Coast suits that looked ridiculous on the prairie. "Josephine, my dear," he boomed, dismounting without being invited. He swept his bowler hat off his sweating head. "Working hard, I see. A commendable if futile effort." "What do you want, Bart?" Josephine said, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd stepped onto the porch, Jax and Shorty emerging from the barn to stand behind her. Drummond's eyes slid past her to Jax. His lip curled in a sneer. "Scraping the bottom of the barrel for help, are we? I heard you'd bought yourself a pet outlaw from the Guthrie jailhouse. A bold move, or a stupid one?" Jax said nothing. He just stood, his weight balanced his hands loose at his sides. He looked bored, but Josephine could see the coiled tension in his shoulders. "This is my property, Bart. State your business or get off it," Josephine said. "Business, of course." Drummond smiled, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. "It's an offer, my dear. A final one. 10 cents on the dollar for this pile of dust. It's more than fair. It's generous. It'll be enough to get you a nice, quiet room back east. Let a man take over this land. This land is mine. It was my husband's, and it's mine. It's not for sale." Drummond's smile vanished. "Don't be a fool, Josephine. That banknote is coming due. You can't possibly make the drive to Abilene with this skeleton crew. You'll be wiped out. I'm offering you charity." "I don't need your charity," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "I'll make the drive." Drummond chuckled. "With him? With Jackson Rourke. Do you even know who he is?" "He's Silas Vane's problem, and Vane has a very permanent way of solving his problems. When he comes looking for his stray, do you think he'll spare your pretty little house?" Jax took one step forward. "That's enough." Drummond's men stiffened their hands, dropping to their guns. "You speak, do you?" Drummond sneered at Jax. "You're property boy. You don't speak to your betters." "I said." Jax repeated his voice, dangerously low. "That's enough. Get on your horse, and get off her land." The air crackled. Drummond, clearly unnerved by the cold certainty in Jax's voice, held his ground for a moment. He looked from Jax's icy stare to Shorty, who was now holding his freshly repaired Winchester. "You're making a mistake, Josephine," Drummond snarled, climbing back onto his horse. "A fatal one. This land will be mine, one way or another." He and his men wheeled their horses around and galloped off, leaving a cloud of choking dust. Josephine was shaking. Shorty let out a long breath. "That man is poison." "He's afraid," Jax said, turning to go back to the barn. "Afraid?" Josephine asked. "He looked ready to kill us." "He's afraid you'll succeed," Jax said. "He's afraid you don't need him, and he's afraid of me." That night, the true meaning of Drummond's threat became clear. Josephine woke to a smell that every rancher dreads smoke. She bolted from her bed, her heart in her throat. Rushing to the window, she saw it. The north pasture, the one holding the 200 head of steers they'd just rounded up, was on fire. A wall of orange flame, fanned by the night wind, was racing toward the herd, and beyond that, the main barn. "Jax Shorty!" she screamed, pulling on her boots. By the time she burst out of the house, Jax was already moving. He wasn't in a panic, he was a general. "Shorty," he roared. "Get the wagon, fill every bucket we have with water. Soak the barn wall now." He ran to the corral and vaulted onto Tempest's bare back, a rope in his hand. "Josephine, get to the rise, wave a blanket. Try to turn the herd east toward the river. I'll try to break them from the front." "The fire," she cried. "It's too fast." "It was set," he yelled back. "Set in 3 places to box them in. It's Drummond. Go now." He kicked Tempest into a full gallop, riding straight toward the inferno. Josephine's blood ran cold. He was riding into a death trap. The smoke was so thick she could barely see him, just a dark shape against the roaring flames. She did as she was told, scrambling up the small hill overlooking the pasture. The steers were frantic, bellowing caught between the fire and the fences. She waved the blanket, screaming until her throat was raw. She watched horrified as Jax rode Tempest through a low part of the fire, his body low over the stallion's neck. He emerged on the other side, a figure from hell, and began riding at the front of the herd, firing his pistol into the air, trying to turn the lead steer. It took an hour of smoke fare and the deafening roar of fire and cattle. But he did it. He turned the herd, stampeding them away from the fire and toward the safety of the river flats. When he rode back, he was covered in soot, his shirt smoking in places. Tempest was lathered and wild-eyed, but unharmed. Shorty had managed to keep the flames from the barn, but the pasture was a blackened, smoking ruin. The holding pens were gone. We saved them," Josephine whispered, slumping against the water trough, her legs giving out. Jax dismounted his face, grim. He walked over to where the fire had started. He knelt, picking something up from the scorched earth. He walked back to her and opened his hand. In his palm sat a small metal flask engraved with the initials BD. He didn't just set the fire. Jax said, his voice a low, cold fury she had never heard before. He stayed to watch. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the dying flames. "He won't stop, Josephine. He tried to ruin you tonight. Next time he'll try to bury you." Josephine looked at the flask, then at the smoking ruin of her pasture, then at the man standing before her. He was no longer her broken outlaw. He was the only thing standing between her and utter destruction. "We leave for Abilene tomorrow," she said, her voice hard as steel. "We'll drive them straight through the night. Let him try to stop us on the open trail." "We'll need another gun," Jax said. "A good one." "We can't afford one," she said. "I know," Jax said, tossing the flask into the dirt. "But I think I know where to find one." Jax rode into Guthrie the next morning, leaving Josephine and Shorty to prepare the herd for the trail. He was gone for hours, and with every tick of the clock, Josephine's anxiety grew. She trusted him. She realized with a start that she truly trusted him. But Guthrie was full of men who knew his face. When he returned, he was not alone. The man who rode beside him was the last person Josephine ever expected to see. It was Marshal Elias Kent. Kent looked even more tired than he had in his office. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping the ranch, noting the scorched pasture and the frantic preparations. "Mrs. Gable," he nodded, his face unreadable. "Marshal," she said, her hands trembling. What are you doing here?" "Your man here," Kent said, jerking a thumb at Jax. "Walked into my office an hour ago, threw a BD initialed flask on my desk and told me about an arson attempt. Then he told me a story. A very complicated story." Josephine looked at Jax. He was watching the marshal, his expression guarded. "He tells me," Kent continued, "that he wasn't just a member of the Red Cimarron Boys. He claims he was working for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, that he was an undercover operative." Josephine's world tilted. "What?" Shorty, who had been loading the chuck wagon, stopped and stared. Jax finally spoke. "It's the truth. My real name is Jackson Rourke, but I wasn't an outlaw. I was a Pinkerton. My job was to infiltrate Vane's gang and get enough evidence to hang him and his entire crew." "A Pinkerton," Shorty scoffed. "And I'm the King of England. You've been spinning us a fine tale, boy." "He's got the credentials," Kent said, pulling a folded oilskin packet from his pocket. He handed it to Josephine. "I wired the Pinkerton office in St. Louis. They corroborated his story. Rourke was one of their best. He'd been deep undercover for almost a year. Josephine opened the packet. Inside was an official-looking identification card with Jax's picture, a younger, cleaner version of him, and a letter of introduction signed by Alan Pinkerton himself. "But the bounty," she stammered. "The murder." "That's where it went wrong," Jax said, his voice flat. "I told you Vane wanted to hit the Coffeyville bank. I tried to talk him out of it. When I couldn't, I sent a wire to the local law warning them. But Vane, he's smarter than people think. He'd been watching me. He suspected a rat." He pointed to the V brand on his shoulder, visible through a tear in his shirt. "He found my telegraph. He and his inner circle cornered me. They gave me the brand. Then they rode to Coffeyville. They knew the law would be waiting, but Vane didn't care. He used it as a diversion. While the deputies were watching the bank, his men hit the land office 3 streets over." "But the bank manager was killed," Josephine whispered. "Vane went back," Jax said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "After the land office, he went to the bank just to prove a point. He walked in, shot the manager, and rode out. The bounty hunters that found me. They weren't bounty hunters. They were Vane's men, paid to drag me to the nearest jail and make sure I was identified as the Coffeyville murderer. He framed me. He neutralized me as a threat and tied up his loose end in one move. He left you to hang," Kent finished. "And the Pinkertons, they disavowed him. An operative who gets caught is a liability. As far as they were concerned, he'd gone rogue." "So," Josephine looked from Jax to Kent. He's not an outlaw at all. He's a free man," Kent said. "Or he would be, if Silas Vane didn't still want him dead. And if Bart Drummond wasn't trying to burn you out." Jax turned to Josephine. "I told the Marshal everything. About Drummond, about the fire, and about Vane. Because I know Vane, and I know Drummond. They're not 2 separate problems, Josephine. They're one." "What do you mean?" "Vane is smart," Jax said. "But Drummond is rich, and Drummond just showed his hand. He's desperate. He'll be watching us leave for Abilene. He'll try to stop us. But he won't do it himself. He'll hire someone. He'll hire Vane." Kent concluded, the dawning horror clear on his face. "Drummond gets the land, and Vane gets his revenge on Rourke. They solve both their problems at once." A cold dread settled over Josephine. "So, what do we do? We can't stay. We'll lose the ranch. We can't go. We'll be slaughtered." "No," Jax said. His eyes were no longer those of a broken prisoner. They were the eyes of a professional, a man with a plan. "We don't run. We set a trap." He turned to Kent. "Drummond thinks he's a rancher. Vane thinks he's a warlord. But they're just businessmen, and we're about to stage a hostile takeover." "How?" Josephine asked. "We leave for Abilene," Jax said, pointing to the herd. "Shorty will take the cattle, push them hard for the first 6 hours, then bed them down in the Cimarron Canyon. It's got high walls, easily defended. He'll be safe there." "And us?" Kent asked. "Us." Jax said, a thin, dangerous smile touching his lips. "We wait. We make Drummond and Vane think the ranch is empty, that we're all on the trail, and when they ride in to burn it to the ground, we'll be waiting for them, right here, in the main house." "It's a siege," Josephine whispered. "They'll have more men." "They will," Jax agreed. "But we have the high ground, and we have the truth." Marshal Kent looked at the ranch house, then at Jax, then at Josephine. He sighed, adjusting his gun belt. "Mrs. Gable, you bought this man to save your ranch. Seems to me you did. But the bill's just come due. Let's get the house boarded up. They'll be here by nightfall." Josephine looked at Jackson Rourke, the Pinkerton agent, the hoarse whisperer, the man she had pulled from the brink of death. He was right. She had bought a target, but she'd also bought a shield, and as she chambered a round into Robert's old rifle, she knew she'd stand beside him to the end. The plan was set in motion with a grim, quiet efficiency. Shorty, his face, a mask of worry, tipped his hat to Josephine. "You be careful, Josie. This is a fool's errand." "You be careful, Shorty," she replied, handing him a canteen. "Keep that herd safe. They're the future." "No, ma'am," the old man said, looking past her to where Jax and Kent were boarding up the parlor windows. "They're just cattle. That's the future." He nodded toward Jax, then rode off, pushing the herd hard to the west, kicking up a massive dust cloud to sell the illusion of a full trail crew. The ranch fell into an eerie silence. Jax, Josephine, and Marshal Kent fortified the main house. They barred the doors, created firing slots in the boarded-up windows, and stockpiled every round of ammunition they had on the central dining table. "Vane will come from the north," Jax explained, his voice low and tactical. "He likes to have the high ground. Drummond the coward will come from the south from his own property. They'll try to pin us in a crossfire." "So we split," Kent said. "I'll take the back bedrooms, watch the south. You take the front parlor, watch the north. Mrs. Gable, you'll stay in the center in the kitchen. You'll reload, and you'll watch the stairs. If they breach the house, you fire at anything that isn't us. Understood?" "Understood." Josephine said, her hand steady as she loaded a shotgun. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a white, hot anger. This was her house. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black, they came. They weren't quiet. They rode in like a conquering army, at least a dozen men. Jax peered through his firing slot. "It's Vane," he confirmed, "and his top men. I see. Him. Silas Vane." On the other side of the house, Kent muttered, "And Drummond's here, with his hired guns. They're meeting. In your yard, Mrs. Gable, bold as brass." Josephine crept to a crack in the kitchen door. She could see them silhouetted against the last light. But Drummond, looking triumphant, was shaking hands with a tall, thin man in a long black duster. Silas Vane. "The house is empty." Drummond's voice carried on the clear night air. "They're gone, on the trail, just as I said. Burn it. Burn it all, and when Rourke doubles back, you can have him." "I get Rourke." Vane's voice was like shale sliding. "You get the land. A pleasure doing business, Mr. Drummond." "Light the torches," Drummond ordered his men. "Now, Marshal," Jax roared. The first shot came from Jax. He'd aimed not at a man, but at the torch held by one of Drummond's men. The torch flew from his hand, and the man screamed, clutching his shattered wrist. All hell broke loose. "They're in the house," Vane screamed, diving for cover behind the water trough. "It's a trap." Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the house. Glass shattered. Splinters flew. Josephine huddled behind the cast-iron stove, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Kent, you see Drummond," Jax yelled over the din. "He ran," Kent shouted back. "The coward bolted for the barn as soon as the first shot was fired. It's just his men and Vane's crew. Now." "They're trying the back door," Jax called. Josephine heard it, a heavy thud, as someone threw their shoulder against the reinforced kitchen door. She raised her shotgun, her breath held. The door splintered. A man burst through his face, wild. Josephine didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, and the man was thrown backward out of the house. She dropped the shotgun, shaking, and fumbled for her rifle. "Good shot, Josephine!" Jax yelled a note of pride in his voice. "Reload!" The fight raged for what felt like an eternity. The house was filling with gunpowder smoke, the noise a constant deafening roar. They were hopelessly outnumbered. "They're in the barn," Kent yelled. "Drummond and 2 of his men. They're trying to set it on fire." "No," Josephine screamed. "Tempest is in there." Jax had insisted on keeping the stallion close. Before Kent could stop him, Jax was moving. "Keep them pinned from the front," he yelled to the marshal. "I'm going out the back." "Jax, no, it's suicide," Josephine cried. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his eyes boring into hers. The icy calm was gone, replaced by a blazing fire. "He will not take anything else from you. Do you hear me? Not the ranch, not that horse. Nothing." He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hard, fast, and desperate. A kiss that tasted of gunpowder sweat and a promise. It was over in a second. "Bar the door behind me," he said. And then he was gone, slipping out the splintered kitchen door and into the darkness. Josephine's mind went blank. She slammed the bar back in place, her lips tingling, her world reduced to the sound of Jax's footsteps, followed by a fresh eruption of gunfire from the barn. "He's lost his mind," Kent yelled, firing through his window. "We're split! They'll overwhelm us!" The frontal assault on the house intensified. Vane, realizing they were a man down, was pushing his men forward. "They're coming through the parlor," Kent shouted. Josephine ran to the parlor just as 2 of Vane's men burst through the shattered front window. She and Kent fired at the same time. The room was a chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting. Meanwhile, in the barn, a different, more personal battle was unfolding. Jax had slipped in through a side hatch. He saw them instantly. Drummond cowering behind a hay bale, and his 2 gunmen who were splashing kerosene on the stalls. Tempest was screaming in his stall, kicking the wood. "Looking for me!" "Bart!" Jax called from the shadows of the loft. The 2 gunmen spun, firing wildly into the darkness. Jax, moving like a ghost, dropped from the loft, landing behind one of them. He disarmed the man with a brutal efficiency, a series of quick, hard strikes that left the man breathless on the floor. The second gunman turned, but he was too slow. Jax was already on him. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a brawl. "Kill him! Kill him!" Drummond shrieked from behind the hay. Jax, ignoring the screaming rancher, dispatched the second man, finishing the fight with a heavy blow from the butt of his pistol. He stood breathing heavily and faced the hay bale. "It's over, Drummond." "Stay back," Drummond yelled, his voice cracking. He emerged holding a small pistol, his hands shaking so violently he could barely aim it. I'll kill you." "You're not a killer, Bart," Jax said, taking a calm step forward. "You're just a thief, and you're not good at that either. The ranch is mine. I'll burn it if I can't have it. No one will." Drummond screamed and fired his pistol. The shot was wild, but it wasn't aimed at Jax. It was aimed at the kerosene-soaked hay. The barn exploded into an inferno. The world turned orange. The force of the explosion threw Jax against the barn wall. Flames engulfed the entire structure in seconds. Through the roaring, he heard 2 sounds: Bart Drummond's terrified screaming as he was trapped by a falling, burning beam, and the high-pitched, agonizing shriek of Tempest. "Jax!" Josephine screamed from the house. She had seen the explosion. Ignoring his own searing pain, Jax scrambled to Tempest's stall. The latch was glowing red, but he didn't care. He wrapped his hands in his jacket and tore the door open. The stallion, his mane already singed, burst out blind with panic. Jax grabbed a fistful of mane, vaulting onto the horse's back, just as he had that first day. "Yaw!" Tempest, trusting the voice, leaped. He cleared the burning doorway and galloped into the yard, just as the barn roof collapsed behind them. The yard was lit like day by the raging fire. The fighting had stopped, Vane's remaining men, seeing the inferno and the demonic figure of Jax emerging from it, lost their nerve. They ran for their horses, all but one. Silas Vane stood alone by the water trough, his duster smoking. He had his pistol in his hand. He and Jax faced each other across the burning yard. "You," Vane hissed, "should have stayed dead." "You," Jax countered, sliding off Tempest, "should have run with your men. I branded you traitor. I made you. I'll be the one to unmake you." Vane raised his pistol. He was fast, but Jax, trained by Pinkertons and honed by survival, was faster. 2 shots cracked almost as one. Silas Vane stood frozen for a second. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his chest. He looked back at Jax, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face. Then he crumpled to the ground. Jax stood, his own pistol smoking. He looked at his left arm. A long, bloody furrow was ploughed through his bicep. Vane's shot. The kitchen door flew open. Josephine ran to him, not even seeing Vane's body. She grabbed his face, her eyes wild with terror and relief. "You're alive, you're alive," she whispered, her hands shaking as she touched his wounded arm. "It's just a scratch." He breathed, his whole body aching. Marshal Kent walked out onto the porch, his rifle smoking. "It's over. The rest are scattered to the winds." He looked at Vane's body, then at the burning barn where Drummond's screams had long since gone silent. "Justice," Kent said, "is a messy business." He walked over to Jax. "Your name is Clear Rourke. The Pinkertons owe you. Vane's gang is broken. Drummond's paid his debts." He looked at Josephine, then back at Jax. "You're a free man. You can go anywhere. What will you do?" Jax looked at the smoking ruin of the barn. He looked at the house, pockmarked with bullet holes. Then he looked at Josephine, her face smudged with soot, her eyes shining with tears. I don't know," he said. The fight was over. The purpose that had driven him, first infiltration, then revenge, then survival, was gone. He was empty. "You're an indentured laborer," Josephine said, her voice catching. He looked at her confused. Josephine the marshal just said, "I paid $500. She said, her hands moving from his arm to his chest, "for a man to help me save my ranch. The ranch is still here. But the barn is gone. The pasture is scorched. The fences are down. The work isn't finished." He understood. He saw the tremor in her lip, the desperate hope in her eyes. She wasn't holding him to a debt. She was giving him a choice. "Josephine," he said, his voice raw, "you bought a broken outlaw, a target." "No," she said finally, letting her tears fall. "I bought a partner. I just didn't know it." He wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her close, burying his face in her smoke-filled hair. "The indentures paid, Josephine," he whispered, "but I'm not leaving." The sun began to rise, casting a pink and gold light over the battered gable crest. Shorty returned later that day, the herd safe. He found Marshal Kent writing his report, and he found Josephine and Jax sitting on the porch steps, side by side, her head on his shoulder, his arm bandaged. They rebuilt. They rebuilt the barn stronger this time. They mended the fences. They drove the cattle to Abilene and got the best price of the season. They paid off the bank and tore up Bart Drummond's old offers. The Gable Crest Ranch didn't just survive. It thrived. It was no longer the widow's ranch. It was the Rourke Ranch. And the man they once called a broken outlaw had, against all odds, found the one thing he'd never been looking for a home. He had been bought, yes, but in saving her, he had become her forever love. And so, a desperate gamble in a dusty jailhouse became the foundation for a love that would rebuild a life. Josephine and Jax proved that the deepest scars don't have to define us, and that sometimes the person who looks the most broken is actually the strongest. They faced down outlaws, greedy neighbors, and the literal fires of destruction, all to find their peace together. What began as a purchase became a partnership, a redemption, and a love story for the ages. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We love bringing these dramatic real-life tales to you every week. If you were moved by Josephine and Jax's fight for survival, please show your support. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story. And most importantly, click subscribe and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have coming up next. We'll see you in the comments.